Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mawat Mongai, and I will be moderating today's discussion on politics, power, and youth economic emancipation in Africa's G20 summit. Now, these are simple yet all-encompassing words that carry complexity, history, and urgency. And for the first time since the first G20 summit that was held in 2008, an African country, South Africa that is, will be hosting this year's G20 summit. Now, the G20 summit brings together the world's largest and most influential economies to address global challenges with the aim of fostering economic cooperation. Now, this year's summit, comes at a time whereby there's a resurgence of economic nationalism across the globe, and this strain of economic nationalism is quite frankly reshaping politics and policies within the world's two largest and most influential economies, that being the USA and China. But there's also another actor, and that is the role of emerging countries. And this is ultimately infecting and affecting the rest of the world, with African countries being the most vulnerable to the shifts and economic shocks that are currently taking place. So therefore, the significance of an African nation hosting the summit at a time when there is a lack of global leadership and at a time whereby there is economic uncertainty should certainly not be overlooked. And in addition to this year's theme, which is advancing solidarity, equality, and sustainability, is quite frankly fitting. Now, the purpose or rather within this context, it propels us to ask and unpack rigorous questions, more frankly, or more specifically, questions such as, is the G20 the right platform to address the various economic challenges, more specifically, the economic challenges that the continent is faced with? Considering that an African nation will be hosting this year's G20, it's only fitting that we address the needs of young people. Considering that Africa has the youngest population, Africa has a median age of 19, it is once again only fitting that the youth is at the center of this discussion. But over and above this, beyond young people perhaps being used as a token, what are some of the practical things that need to happen at a global level? And moreover, how can this translate into everyday national policies and therefore everyday lived experiences? Now, before we continue with this webinar and engaging in this critical discussion, let's just take care of some housekeeping. Can all speakers just ensure that when you are speaking and it's your turn to engage, make sure that your camera is on, and also make sure that your mute button is unmuted. And when you're not speaking, please ensure that you do mute yourself. And to all our participants, please do feel free to engage with us, ask the questions within the Q&A tab. And after the discussion is done, we will make sure that we address all of the questions that do come our way. Now, before we get into the discussion, let me just introduce our 5 key panelists. Our first speaker is Linen Munyai, who is a civil society liaison officer at the African Peer Review Mechanism. He holds a master's in international relations and is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Johannesburg. We also have Kagiso, aka TK Pue, who is a senior lecturer at the Wits School of Governance, specializing in public policy, and has over a decade experience of lecturing and consulting in institutions such as UKZN, Northwest University, and the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute. We are also joined by Moeketsi Kauhela, who holds an MA in sociology. He is the co-chair of the Y20 South Africa and is an education and training officer in the youth activism program at the Ahmed Kathadra Foundation, and also represents the foundation at the National Youth Coalition. We are also joined by Tami Masingi, who is a policy, mobilizing, and capacity manager at YD CoLab. Tami has a strong background and experience in policy advocacy, capacity building, and youth empowerment. We are also joined by by Mahloromela Siabi, who is the chairman of the Postgraduate Association at Wits University. He holds the BSc Honors in Computer Science and is currently pursuing an MSc in Computer Science. And last but not least, we are joined by Mpilo Cele, who is the executive chairman of the South African Youth Association of Global Affairs. Mpilo is currently completing his MA and is recognized as an emerging leader under the Wits University Emerging Leadership Program. Now, according to the Afrobarometer, that is, young people are more likely than their elders to express dissatisfaction with democracy, mistrust in leaders, and also consider military intervention against abusive leaders. Now, despite this, the youth's influence on national policies remains quite limited. And there's also a prevailing sense that traditional policies, or rather politics and representative democracy, fails to resonate with younger cohorts. Now, in addition to all of this, the Afrobarometer also found that African youth are less likely than the older generation to engage in a variety of political and civic activities, with one exception, and that being protest action. But even so, the difference between protest action engaged by younger people versus the older generation is not that significant. It's a 2-point difference. Now, Lennon, I have a 2-point question for you, and that being, how is civic engagement evolving in Africa? And can platforms like the G20 summit ensure that the policies and commitments that are made can effectively amplify the voices and influence of young people, both at national and regional decision making? Thanks.
Thank you so much, good doctor. My name is Lennon Munyai. I'm a champion for young people here at the African Union. I am a researcher, and I also engage with civil society. I think it's such a timely opportunity for us to have this conversation, not only as Africans, but with also other networks of young people from the G20 countries. The year has been packed with so many programs and activities that have to do with the G20 here in South Africa. You have, for instance, the Women 20, the Youth 20, Think Tank 20, something that we should celebrate and commend South African government as well as South African people for bringing up such innovative initiatives for engaging ordinary people. I can certainly tell you that based on the data that you referenced from Afrobarometer, there is definitely a democratic backslide in Africa, with shrinking spaces for civic engagement. And as a result, we have seen frustrations that tend to become violent protests taking place in a number of African countries. Some of them in the recent past have been, to some extent, hijacked by military apparatus and resulting in unconstitutional changes of government, in particular in the Sahel region, and some countries in the African Union are currently suspended because the African Union has zero tolerance to unconstitutional changes of government. But we're also seeing a rise in digital activism, if you like, keyboard warriors, for a lack of a better term. But this is happening in a continent where access to internet is extremely low, and internet is very, the cost of internet is very high. At the moment, close to 65% of the African continent is not connected to the internet. So that tells you that as much as young people in particular are becoming more and more engaged online, learning, mobilizing, peer learning, and etc., there's a big chunk of the African population that is not connected, largely because of the rural-urban divide, the cost, and inequalities that are there on the African continent. So I really like the theme that South Africa chose that also looks at equity, something that Brazil presidency focused on. So other than the changes that are taking place on the African continent and to some extent in the global south, because I look at South Africa's chairing of the G20, not only as a South African presidency, but an African presidency, as well as a continuation of the global south presidency. So the changes that are taking place in Africa, I think to some extent also relate to other countries in the global south, in that there's increased distrust in formal institutions. While there's this distrust, there's an increasing role of civil society in voicing out, especially online. If you go on different social media platforms, whether it's TikTok, Facebook, the voices of those that at least can go online are being sort of amplified. But there's also this big population that is underrepresented and whose voices cannot be heard. And I think that's a challenge, particularly for Africans in our presidency, to bring these voices to the forefront. Now, as far as young people are concerned, I'll recommend a number of things. One, the continuation of Brazil's sort of championing of reforms of global institutions such as the United Nations Security Council. Civil society in particular, the young people in civil society can start and continue sort of agitating for that and join hands. In particular, Africa needs a seat on the Security Council. And at the moment, the Security Council is currently crippled to some extent and cannot make decisions. There's another thing that South Africa is championing, access to finance and credit. In particular, credit rating agencies have been extremely unfair. These are areas in which civil society, particularly youth, have not paid attention to. We tend to pay attention to issues that have to do with democracy and political governance. However, economic governance and corporate governance, we tend not to steer into. And it's an area that I think we need to pick up efforts in terms of championing. Credit rating agencies, the big ones throughout the world, Moody's, Fitch, you name them, they tend to disadvantage global south countries, in particular African countries, with really unfair tools of analyzing and making the cost of borrowing extremely high. And I think there's a need for Africans, in particular South Africans, to take this strongly, particularly in our presidency, so that we can champion access to, if possible, cheaper cost of borrowing. I think the point that I already raised earlier on will be the highlight of my presentation, to say we are privileged to be able to have access to internet, energy, and be able to connect. However, there is the bulk of Africa does not have this access, and their voices need to be heard. And we as young people, particularly those in civil society, have to find ways of making sure that voices of those in suburban areas, the townships, those in the rural areas, how do we make sure that the G20 is not a far-fetched idea for ordinary citizens in our countries? Secondly, Africans in other African countries, they need to be part and parcel of this conversation. So I hope the next webinar that we're going to host, we're going to have other voices of young people in other African countries coming also on board to share their perspective, some of their aspirations, and etc. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. Thank you, Lennon. And you raised actually quite some key points, especially around the issue around credit ratings, international credit ratings, and some of the critiques that have been raised by African nations. And if anything, I think that it speaks into this whole discussion of we are currently experiencing a global shift. And it's quite interesting. It's not the first, but it's quite interesting to see the different actors or the new actors that emerge with each global shift that is taking place. I'm going to come back to you, but I want to bring in TK into the discussion. TK, in line with what Lennon has just raised and some of the key critical questions that, his points kind of force one to kind of ask, I want to ask you, a topic around economic nationalism. Now, economic nationalism is not only on the rise at a global level, but there is also evidence of it at a regional and national level. I mean, if you consider Trump's global tariffs, if you consider issues such as Tanzania's ban on foreigners operating small businesses, tensions between locals in South Africa and other African nationals, all of these events that have and are taking place represent challenges between prioritizing national interests versus prioritizing and advancing global interests. Where does the G20 fit into all of this? And does the G20 represent a site of policy innovation and development possibilities, or is it just another talk workshop?
Well, Dr. Mfai, thank you so much for having me, and thank you. Afternoon to the viewers at large. Look, I think it's an excellent question, but maybe I'd center it by, I think let's agree maybe on a few common things, as you correctly stated. One, I just said beforehand. Let me just maybe start with these ones. For instance, as you correctly say, let's look at the situation for youth in places. Let's say like in East Africa. I think unemployment there stands between 48 to 57%. West Africa between 24.9 to 30. Southern Africa 46. Central Africa 20 to 40. North Africa 20 to 32. I say these numbers so that we could kind of almost say to answer your question backwards, to say where should the site of struggle be for young people. Now, if we understand how the matrix and how the history of the G20 started, and even South Africa's invitation to the G20, because again, the G20 is the largest economies. Yes, the AU, the African Union has been invited, but we all know South Africa's economy is not there. So, which really does raise what you said: is this a talk shop, or do they mean well? Look, let's be positive in the sense that it is a platform where a country like South Africa, like India previously, where you can raise certain issues of your subnational condition to be able to elevate them. Now, this is where my critique maybe of the South African government will come in. To say, I think this G20 finds South Africa and the African continent probably at the worst time. You've just mentioned issues of economic nationalism. Well, we can't hide the person in the room. I mean, the orange person in the room. I'm not orange. I'm looking at my color there, but we know who he's speaking about, namely the President of the United States of America. But I always make this point that President Trump is not the problem. President Trump is a symptom of the larger system asking questions where we're finding that there's a polycrisis of issues. One, the question of what does the economy look like for tomorrow? Right now, I think it more than makes sense that each and every country would want to protect themselves. I know South Africans always get, and this is where maybe I'll be a bit controversial. I always do wonder when NGOs and other entities make it a South Africa exceptional when South Africans ask the question, why aren't you protecting our jobs first? South Africa first type of situation. Because I know you mentioned Tanzania, but if you actually look at the constitution of many African countries, let's look at our neighbor Zimbabwe, they're quite clear about who can be involved in the informal economy. It has to be nationals, not foreigners. How should you do that? So what I'm trying to paint towards a picture is when I say the G20 finds out at the worst time is many of the failures of the African continent, African governments are really projected onto the youth. That is why we've got a high youth unemployment rate. Now, the G20 can only do so much provided that the country that is hosting has a clear agenda. I make reference to India that if you look at the India project, they were very meticulous about what they wanted. Key among them, for their own national politics, they wanted to make sure the African Union got a seat. Now, what has happened that subsequently to that? You have seen that the Indian government has been very purposeful in trying to invest and get a foothold onto the continent. So the question I'd ask, if we really are judging South Africa's one, to say, the points that you've brought across, what are they linked to in terms of South Africa's greater macroeconomic problems and indicators? When it's over and done with in November, December, does the South African state-owned entities, private sector, have the ability now to go play in this market, in this contested environment? I'll leave it to the audience to kind of make up their mind in terms of that. Now, the key area where I'll give them credit for is the issue of it's a question which I think is quite important. Everybody knows it. It's we call it beneficiation, but I think the new term people now use is critical raw minerals. That is important. But again, it's one thing to raise a known issue. It's another question to say what follows that known issue. And we have to ask the question. You, as South Africa's presidency, have raised it as a point. You've said that the continent really wants to beneficiate. Where is your proven test point, or what do I say, your proof of concept? I don't see any of our big state-owned entities that should be involved in those that especially have mining inclination that should be involved on the continent. Do you see them? I see the private sector, but it's still a relationship of you extract and you take back to Europe. So this is my critique of G20. It's of and by itself, it really doesn't mean much, but it can be made to mean something when a country has got a particular agenda at hand. And I think the critique of the South African government I'd have is that our agenda is not tied, like many things in South Africa, to a broader macroeconomic plan. We are raising the correct issues. The continent should be beneficiating. The continent should be worried about youth unemployment. However, it's the instrumentality that comes after that. At the moment and point, we've just come from an election. We still don't know what the economic development plan and trajectory of the country is. So again, is the G20 in service of what? Because again, South Africa will get great kudos from international partners, because this is where I think we always should be a bit wary. Many of the countries would love to raise this point South Africa is raising at the G20. But you should be very concerned if you're the only person marching and everybody who's supposed to be behind you is quiet. So that is probably my opening salvo to say that G20 of and by itself doesn't really mean much unless it's attached to a bigger plan. And maybe in this platform, that's what I probably want to hear more about, to say, have we seen a plan that's connected to our private sector, state-owned entities, and that's connected to a larger macroeconomic plan? And unfortunately, that's what I do not see. As it relates to the other African countries, at the moment, I'm at the privilege of working in Kigali. I'm in the Africa School of Government. That's my new place of employment. And I can tell you, East Africa is very methodical about what they want. And it's not necessarily tied to a G20 agenda. It's tied to a bigger regional agenda that they say, listen, the region has a plan. The countries in the region have a plan, and that's what they're working towards. Did they need G20? You don't even hear much about it here in places like Rwanda and in East Africa. What they're more worried about is how do they get their regional integration to work, and how do they get the economy to work? So sometimes we need to ask ourselves as South Africa, when we project ourselves as this force, I think sometimes it's a bit of a falsity in the sense that we want to be this altruistic thing, but in other countries, they're quite clear about their agenda. They're not ashamed. This is the agenda of the economy. And I think South Africa is suffering a bit from the politics of the 90s. I call it the 1994 moment that we want to be everything to everyone, but we cannot answer the critical questions of the home base. And I suspect that once this G20 goes by, many of those questions which are left unanswered, and especially questions about youth unemployment and youth participation in the economy, are going to come back home. And the key question people are going to ask is, did the G20 advance these beyond talk shops? And I think we kind of all know what the answer is going to be.
Thank you, TK, getting us right into it. You raised some critical questions. And for me, one of the key things that stand out from what you're saying is it's all good and well to have this international platform. However, how does this link into the national agenda? How does this link into the current economic development plan, if there is even a concrete one? And this actually now brings me, Mbila, I actually want to ask you, in light of what TK has just mentioned now, reality is South Africa, has been facing, deindustrialization for about 10 or so years. And this has created a widening gap between the skills demanded by the economy as well as opportunities available to young people. And as a result, we are now facing a post-35-year generation that has never adequately been equipped to participate in the workforce. What are some of the strategies that South African government and the global partners prioritize within this G platform, such as the G20, to bridge the skills gap, both to empower the youth entering into the economy, as well as to prevent older generation from becoming permanently excluded from economic, political participation?
Well, firstly, thank you so much, Doc. Thank you so much for unveiling this opportunity to us to come and contribute. Great points made by the previous two speakers. And I think to add on your question at the moment, the issue of unemployment in South Africa, but not only just in South Africa, but also in the continent. And looking at the fact that, for example, in South Africa, you have a youth population of around 60% that is unemployed, which means these are the young people that are not economically active in the economy. They are not participating at all. And number two, we have an issue of ageism, which has entered into those politics. The issue that after 35, you're unemployable. And then you have an issue of a generation that was trained under a different economic skill set, which most of the time we can refer to that plan as the apartheid plan, for example, in South Africa, whereby that older generation grew up under. So obviously now, faced with that question in 2025, you are facing a lot of contradictions. Number one, I can say clear that for me, with how I'm looking at things, it is a failure of neoliberalism. It is a failure of how the economy was planned after 1994 to try and bring in private actors to take a critical role in building the economy of this country. And we should remember the context that this was a time whereby South Africa was transitioning from a state that was once sanctioned and excluded from the global economy to this country now that has gained freedom, and it's also gaining freedom at a time whereby now neoliberalism and globalization are actually gaining favor, within the institutions. So obviously, this would face contradictions later on. Firstly, there was a point which was made about the unilateral global tariffs, that we see today. And if you look at the history of how to even come to this point whereby now we see countries such as the US, for example, then go about in doing these global tariffs, and also looking at the reasoning, for example, behind those global tariffs, you can see that the question is a question of, has globalization worked for most of us? Because if you look at what exactly is behind this, is the fact that the US economy anymore, it is no longer an economy of industrialization. It is no longer an economy whereby the people of the United States, who were once hard workers in the industries and in the manufacturing sector, that skill set has been moved to China, and those are the people that can make an iPhone very easily. These are the people who can make the EV cars very easily and everything. And now we are left with this question of people who have a different skill set that is not fitting within this current context. Because if you look at the nature of the US economy, it is an economy that is services and finance-based economy. So it is an economy that is catering for the highest of the population. And you can also see that in South Africa, that is the case in South Africa. We should be worried, Mabato, by the fact that in South Africa, you have a GDP that depends largely on financial services, but not only on financial services, but also increasingly on a financialization model. That is what we call a financialization model, whereby now the means of production are not necessarily your land and your industries that you literally build, but it is an economy that exists in the air. And now this economy, number one, is prioritizes shareholder returns. Number two, it prioritizes profits. And this is an economy that depends largely on how investors are feeling about a particular economy. And I think for anyone that studied economics, you'd hear arguments, for example, of Joseph Stiglitz. You would hear arguments from Mariano Mazzucato saying that now the problem with this kind of economy is that there is no methodology or matrix to say this economy it is worth investing in for or against. If an investor feels like we are not happy, for example, with the political leadership of this country, then we can easily say we are not confident in investing into this economy. And I think this then goes to the broader discussion which Lennon touched on earlier on when we were speaking about credit ratings and how they've been unfair to the African economies. Therefore, then to answer this question and sorry to make that very long background, but I just want to arrive safely on this point, that then now the point of youth unemployment in South Africa, firstly, we really have to rethink our economic model in South Africa and also our macroeconomic policy. That is the very first thing. So one can simply say, and if you want straight solutions, but this solution will never work without a proper macroeconomic model that is going to govern those things. Because when now some of us who know who are on the new school of thoughts in economics, who try to rethink economics, we do say that, for example, the role of the central banks, we should not only just be for inflation targeting and price stability, but it should move towards that and actually incorporate on how then do you bring employment, as part of your mandates. Because if you look, for example, in the Japanese model and also in the US model, you'd find that the central bank, which in South Africa is the South African Reserve Bank, they play a critical role in ensuring that as much as we do maintain price stability and inflation targeting, but at the very same time also, we are making sure that we are meeting this particular target in terms of employment of people into our economy. So, for example, one role that the South African Reserve Bank could be doing, and I'm happy that now this argument is actually attracting to the public discourse, because it has been something for years within the school of thought of economics which has always been rejected. But now it is clear that, for example, that you cannot then gain what we call full employment if you are not going to involve the central bank, which is the only institution, by the way, in any sovereign state that has the power and the mandate to print money. Because now, if you create projects that are state-owned and state-controlled, it is easy for you to inject projects into that particular into certain projects. For example, if you have to build roads in South Africa, you can build roads in South Africa whereby there's no private sector participation in making sure that you do create employment in short-term and long-term in terms of maintenance of those particular roads. But also, not only just that, but then we have to include the fact that there are also many other things which are still lacking. Actually, there was an article which I think was written, 2 days ago, saying that Gauteng is the only state-of-the-art infrastructure of South Africa, which means that we are still lacking behind. We still have schools, and you can literally build schools without crowding out the private sector, because the question of the inflation becomes an issue whereby if you're going to put money into the market, and then there's going to be other players also, and there's going to be an unfair advantage which is going to lead into inflation. But now, just to come back safely to your question and try to answer this thing, I can say that, for example, now we are moving in terms of digital economy. So digital literacy is one of the fundamental skills that young people should be having at this point of age and time. Number two, we have new sectors which are rising, not only just in the global north, but actually in the global south. And particularly if you look in countries like Kenya, they're actually very leading, followed by South Africa. And there is the fintech industry. The financial technology industry is very much growing. And it's unfortunate that with a lot of population that depends on government schools that do not have a quality infrastructure, they are still going to be left behind, even in this period of this particular boom. I think one thing that is very much important, which now speaks about participation of young people in politics, it's the fact that we cannot leave the skill of critical thinking behind. I know that one of the main arguments that is usually said at universities is that we should try and rethink humanities degrees and everything, but then we should ask ourselves, why are they concerned about humanities degree? Because for the fact that we are now being able to interrogate and see that there's something wrong with the system, it is a product of those critical thinking skills whereby are not taught or told that this is what you should be learning, but rather to be able to interrogate the knowledge that you're actually given. So on the old people side, I can say that actually to try and reskill those people back into the economy, as I touched earlier on the fact that, for example, if you look at the Donald Trump plan in terms of trying to put tariffs, particularly targeting China, it is to make sure that industries go back to the United States. Because if you see the deals that it's been making, it's the fact that the EU must invest in the United States economy. It must put industries back into the United States, all of those kind of things. Therefore, you can see that the critical question which TK also touched on is then a question of how has this model been working over the last few decades. And we can say that now, in terms of in the South African context, we can say that one of the main things that maybe we should now be starting to think about, it's also how then do we reskill older people for the skills of the future. And it is unfortunate that now in South Africa, not in terms of age, but in terms of your economic participation, the moment you are 36, you are now regarded as older, because you can see the job descriptions very clear that we want a person that is 18 to 35, which means now this particular person who's 36 and above, they are no longer possible to be economically participative. Therefore, then what should really concern us is really the economic model that has been governing South Africa for such a long period of time, and see how then do we mainstream those people back into the economy. Because we can bring the question of, no, there's green energy that is booming at the moment. There is a question of digital literacy that is booming at the moment. But if you still have an issue of ageism, I think that's going to be a problem, both in terms of short-term and long-term planning. I think for the Mabato, I'll end there for now. And if you have any other questions, I can interject.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mpilo, for that contribution. I can actually tell you now that we actually have a bunch of questions already coming through based off of not only what you have said, but also just the other contributions. And you ask, a very important question around how do we actually reskill the older generation, specifically those within the specific age range of 36 and above, and over and above that, to prevent the kind of the current youth cohort from becoming quote unquote the lost generation. I want to now bring it back to on the ground impact and level impact that all of this has. Moeketsi, you've worked with the youth directly on, quite frankly, a daily basis. And beyond the statistics, beyond the headlines, you have firsthand insight into the lived experiences and aspirations of young people. From your perspective, what are the most critical barriers, not only preventing young people from translating their political and economic hopes into real influence, but how can a global platform such as the G20 help address some of these challenges?
No, thank you so much, Mabatu, for having me, and to the speakers as well. And good afternoon to the colleagues who are joining us as part of the audience. I mean, I think for me, Mabatu, in terms of those critical barriers that, preventing young people, as informed by my own work in the youth, civil society and development space. I mean, I think one, I want to speak to, I think the young people are experiencing some lack of high-level platforms. And essentially, really what I mean by that is that, when you look at the fact that many of our young people who are social entrepreneurs, right, in their own right, and also innovators, I think, there's this lack of access to particularly, significant national and international platforms where we can be able to share ideas, where we can network, but also I think, Mabatu, to collaborate on matters, particularly as it relates to, youth engagement, but also, of course, linking that to, some of these national goals that we have and even global goals that we have, like the sustainable development goals, right? And where are we in terms of those goals and meeting the targets of those goals? And really for me, the second one with regards to some of these critical barriers, Dr. Mabatu, is on skills gap, right? And I think both the speakers before me spoke to this, right? And I think for me, there's this growing need, to expose, for example, our young people to entrepreneurial leadership and, of course, practical knowledge and skills that support their economic access, right? And I think here, I'm linking with what, TK had raised, Dr. Poe had raised, particularly around what are these plans that we have and where are young people, where's the proof, right? And the third one for me is around social capital, right? And I think even, Mpilo speaks to this, particularly around, due to the lack of platforms on which we can engage, I think for me at a local, regional, but also I think with global partners, right? And I think, again, Dr. Poe also raises this in his meditations, because I think, the ability of particularly our young entrepreneurs, but also even innovators, to meet that broad range of stakeholders, but also creating that collaborative relationships are often limited, right? And what does that look like? And I raise that in light of the fact that, when you opened up for us, you mentioned how, and I think you are alluding to the fact that the world is becoming more African, right? Given that we know that research is already indicating that by 2050 alone, 1 in 4 people in the African continent will be a young person, right? Where more than a third of the world's young people will live in this continent by 2050. So for me, how do we make sure that there are those local, national, regional, and partnerships? But also, I think for me, the fourth one would have to be on economic access, right? How do we empower our youth to leverage, entrepreneurship as a pathway to, again, economic inclusion, but also contribution, which I think is very critical. And the last one for me, Dr. Mabatu, with regards to those critical barriers, it's really on policy and data, right? Particularly if we're considering, South Africa's G20 presidency as a backdrop. I think it is important, that we have our young people actively engaging with the data, the policy decisions, and new knowledge, that is being generated for and about them, right? That whole thing of nothing, for us without us, right? And I think for me, global, platforms like the G20, for me, they how we can perhaps maybe leverage off of them to make sure, that we address some of these critical areas that I've highlighted, and I've only limited myself, to 5, is particularly when we're looking at specifically the youth engagement group that I'm co-chairing of the Y20s, that we've provided young people there, to essentially engage policy, right? Where young people, whether you're from a rural, township or a rural area, township or informal, or wherever you're from, right? But also appreciating the fact that South Africa's G20 presidency is also to be seen to be Africa's G20. Young people shaping policy across the 5 thematic tracks that we've been working under, shaping policy around climate change, environmental sustainability, right? Essentially, what are those, green horizons? What does it mean when we say want to lead a just energy transition? But also young people being able to shape policies and telling us that this is what inclusive economic growth looks like, and these are the pathways to prosperity from our lived experiences, right? And the third one, of course, on AI, digital innovation, and those key competency skills we need to essentially connect our young people with as it relates to AI, but also the ethical considerations of AI. And the fourth one, really on meaningful youth engagement and reform multilateral institutions, because again, our young people are hungry for opportunity, not just employment opportunity, but to also be in these multilateral spaces where they're able to shape some of these global policies that are taken on their behalf as the powers that be. And really the last one on inclusive social development and fighting inequality. What does it mean when we say want to leave no one behind? Because I do think, Mabatu, we can no longer rely on old-fashioned ways on convening, but also on even policy making. Because I think what that has proved by even what we're seeing in what's happening, I mean, right now in Nepal, what's happened in Bangladesh, certainly what's happened in the African continent, when we're looking at, the DRC, the Horn, the Sahel region, the SADC region, where young people are taking to the streets, but also where young people are joining extremist movements because they do not have access to employment, because we're making it difficult for young people to live, right? And what does that mean? And I think I'll leave it there and happy to engage further. But I do think we can no longer play a chess game with young people's lives, because we've seen what happens when we do turn young people's lives into a chessboard, right? And we've seen the ramifications of that. And certainly, I think Dr. Poe spoke about it when he was also highlighting some of the work that's been done in the regions as well, in this continent of ours. Dr. Mongai?
Thank you, Moiketsi. And you raised some very valid points within the examples that you gave. If anything, to me, it highlights that we are witnessing the daily consequences of young people being excluded. You used the phrase to say, nothing for us without us. And I would pose the same question, I know that there's like the Y20, and, earlier on, Tika had mentioned to say, how does the objectives, the agenda that is set out for the G20, does it speak into national agenda? In fact, what is the national agenda beyond broad statements such as more youth participation and so forth? I'm going to bring in Matloromela into the discussion. You are the chairman of the Postgraduate Association at Wits, so you're quite privy to the challenges faced by university as well as, students. Now, we mentioned a bit earlier on that we're in the midst of a global shift. And this shift is also being shaped by, Mpilo had mentioned this a bit earlier on, by factors such as the fourth industrial revolution, more specifically, things such as AI. Lennon had mentioned social media. Now, all of these factors, mean that there is a new skills that are required. And as such, they are new. The learning needs are changing. So some pose or make the statement or questioning rather the relevance of degrees, whereas others argue that universities need to readapt. Now, within the context of the challenges faced by students and universities, how does the current university structure need to be reimagined, if at all?
Okay, no, thank you, Dr. Mabatu. Thank you for this opportunity. Before I answer your question, I just want to make a comment that, South Africa was suffering from this dependence, was suffering from ideas from the Western world, and it has infiltrated our systems. That's why today we're here and asking ourselves about our education systems. Let's speak about a certain factor that happened just recently on the tariffs. I'll come back to your question. When Donald Trump removed the tariffs on South Africa on the US aid, what happened is that our students within the health campus, the students that research on health matters, they were affected. So we really have an issue of depending on Western ideologies as well as ideas from other people. You can even see it with the AU. I mean, the headquarters of AU was built by the Chinese. You are telling me that African billionaires and states of South Africa couldn't meet and build the African Union. So for us to start thinking about reimagining our education, we need to reimagine how we think, and if we are still want to depend on ideas from other places. So now let's come back to your question. Let's look at the USA and China. Education is a very important factor within any country, within any continent to per se to move and function. So the USA, has this thing of taking our talent from Africa and they go to their institution, your Cambridge, your Harvard, and they create research from that side. And the research is relevant to what? To the USA. It's relevant to the United Nations, the European nations, So that's what has happened. It's a brain drain. But one strategy that was employed by China was to deploy its students to the USA, all these prestigious universities, and those students came back to China. And look at how China now it's moving. So China had employed its own strategy. The question is, what's happening with the Black Africans which are in these other institutions? But that's a question to just look at. It's something that to look at. Our education is not relevant to our growth today. There's a down looking on our TVETs. Not only on universities, we also have TVETs that are being downlooked. We still need plumbers. As much as, yes, we're in the age of AI, but we need a plumber. How many infrastructures are here in Johannesburg? How many roads needs to be fixed? There's another issue of gender-based violence by teachers. It's from primary, secondary, and also high school. And there's also cohesion up from lectures on our students. So when we speak about reimagining our education, it can't just be in one approach about skills. We need to look at it at a broader level. And there's some neoliberal liberal Black officials. You'll have a vice chancellor who's earning 7 million. I mean, he could take why shouldn't he just earn $1 million or 500,000, and the other money goes towards our students, and our students start learning about this AI, and we reimagine how our education system should be shaped. Something I want to touch on is the concept of education. Education is a right, but it has been commodified in South Africa and most nations in Africa. It's a right. So what needs to happen? Right now, our students are going to be blacklisted. And we're speaking about G20. I don't know what G20 will assist us to do. I just think that is just a networking session for our presidents and officials, But coming on the solutions, because it doesn't assist us to just speak about, the issues that we face, but we need to see how we move forward in terms of advancing our country. But this conversation here with us alone, it won't go anywhere. We need the officials, we need the decision makers. But again, the decision makers today, it's people who are not representing Africa. So really, I don't know if we're going to change or not, but I'll still continue to speak because that's what we'll do. We will still speak. Look, I would like to argue that our education system teaches our people in a blanket approach, from basic education up until higher education. So we need to have a targeted approach. Some students learn by visual, some students learn by listening, some students learn by all of the above mentioned, So we need to have a targeted approach towards our students. With the age of AI that's coming in, we need to see how we can adapt the AI to have a targeted intervention on each and every learner we have within our institutions, within our schools, starting from primary up until where we are today. But furthermore, we need to also increase mental health support at our schools, starting from primary. I won't speak about university alone because it starts at a young age up until where we are. In Pedi, there's this word proverb that we say that tutela bogolo ya roba. So you need to start them as they are young. Another thing we need to look at now is the lecturers at our institutions. Now we hire someone who did maths alone to become a lecturer. That's another issue. This person doesn't know how to teach. So there needs to be a targeted approach in terms of upskilling our lecturers to be able to teach. You can't tell me the entire classes fail and the issue is the class. So the issue is not the class. The issue is that we have someone who's just been an academic for their entire life, just writing their research and releasing papers. Today they must teach. Today they must lecture. So that's one issue that we have. And then something that we need to look at is we need to shape and think about how we can research and work towards African issues. And for us to work towards that, we need to embed history within our education system, starting from primary, from grade R, up until university. At university level, if you are doing civil engineering, you will need to be taught about the civilization of Timbuktu. You need to know how those buildings were built and what made them to be erosion resistant. Today, we just have tar roads that erode year by year. I don't know what's happening. I don't know, is it the quality of our education or it's what? But we need to embed the history, but the history of Africa. We had establishments back then that were relevant to Africa. So we need to go back, embed that into our system. If you're doing computer science, we need to embed history that aligns with mathematics within the African context. That's how we're going to solve issues of Africa. It's not going to take 2 years to change. It's going to take years. So we need to be committed if we want to change. I still want to argue that, we should stop being, followers. Fourth industrial revolution, we're following. It's AI. We're following again. How many people will be part of the AI? How many people have access to electricity? How many people have access to telephones? How many people have access to internet access? So we're still followers. We have our own institutions, the Pan-African University by the AU, So we need to take our support towards the Pan-African universities, but how do we make them, uplift them to be as high as your Harvard, as high as your vets? It's about research output. We need to research something that is relevant. And what is relevant to Africa? That's what we need to determine. What is relevant? Is democracy relevant to Africa? But that's not the main question of today. So we can speak about adapting to social media and whatnot, but we need to think about what is relevant to us. We still have a long way to go, and we need to start now. It's in our leadership that needs to be changed. There's a lot of areas that we need to change. We need data for our institution to go higher, for our people to learn about AI, but AI that is relevant to Africa. Instead of our people using ChatGPT, we need to have our own AI model in Africa. But for you to have to store your data, you need data centers. Data centers need electricity. So, it goes back to the leadership on making interventions. We now will be dealing with symptoms right now when we say, oh no, we need to start dealing with AI. There's an issue, electricity access, that we need to think about, And from there, I'm telling you, things will change. We'll have industrialization that we need. We'll be able to move from importing finished goods, to exporting finished goods. We'll stop this thing of exporting our gold to these nations, because that's what we want. We want to understand how Mapungube, had gold and they molded their own rhinoceros, there. We need to use that history, show that knowledge, it's within. Knowledge is not, taken from somewhere else. We can still uplift our nations as South Africans and Africans. So there needs to be some decisions that are made by our leaders. Or we also need to make a decision that, are we happy with the kind of leadership that we have? That's my comment. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Matlorumela. And you making some bold statements there in terms of what needs to be done. And, with one of the key questions that you keep highlighting is what is relevant to Africa. And I suppose the question that comes forth, or at least a thought process that this sparks, is, do we have the patience to readapt to what is relevant to the African continent? And more specifically, keeping in mind that, each continent, each sub-region is faced by different interests, different challenges, and therefore different priorities. Does this mean that this should be done in isolation? Does this mean that we should learn how to partner? How does this look like on a practical level? Thank you. Thank you so much for your contribution. Tammy, I want to go back to, the question around preventing a lost generation. More specifically, considering, TK had mentioned the statistics. My correction, TK, sorry, had mentioned the different unemployment statistics from, different sub-regions, different African nations. These are abnormal figures. These are figures that should be leaving every sector in society with a sense of urgency. One can arguably say that we have and are becoming either desensitized or decision paralysis. We recognize that it is a challenge, but not knowing how to shift the needle. In light of the statistics that was mentioned, in light of the socioeconomic challenges that the youth is facing on all fronts, education, unemployment, and so forth, are we at risk of creating a lost generation? And if so, from a very practical level, what bold interventions are needed to ensure that the youth can make not only meaningful contributions towards the future, but to prevent this potential lost generation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mawatu. Thank you for having me on this platform. And a big shout out to the previous speaker. He really touched on topics that I was quite passionate about in my earlier youth days in terms of our education and what needs to be done there, especially in the TVET sector. So I really appreciated his comments. It's really made my day. The question that you're asking is quite a difficult question. It's not an easy question to answer, and I don't think I'd be honest if I said I can answer it conclusively, but I will give it a try. I will give it a shot. I think, given the current status of South Africa and Africa, I think my answer will also focus mainly on South Africa as a frame of reference, is that it's quite easy to fall into the trap of despair. It's quite easy to fall into the cycle of hopelessness when you look all around you and midday at 12 p.m., the streets are filled with young people in the townships and rural areas, lazing around and having nothing to do that is productive, right? It's quite easy to fall into the cycle of hopelessness when you look at the stats of the Northern Cape, where you see high rates of suicides and high rates of fetal alcohol syndrome, right? It's quite easy to fall into that particular trap and say we are at risk of a lost generation per se, right? Or when you just look at how dark statistics are when it comes to young people in this country, right? And I do want to say, despite that, I do think we also need to take a step back and somewhat have a positive outlook as to what South Africa can be, or what the continent can be, and remember that stars are born in the dark. But yeah, I do think, looking at the great concerns that we have, youth unemployment is quite high. It's ridiculous to have a majority of your youth being unemployed, one, or being unemployable. That's another key factor that we need to also consider, right? The mental health state of young people as a result of not being able to be included into the economic systems or play a key role into that, as well as the public decision-making processes, because we sometimes look at young people can't get jobs, but we forget that decision makers and political parties also play a key role in creating an environment that can enable them to participate in the economic system or into public participation processes. Right? So, we need to also look into the concerns that are linked in and around that. And I want to just use a basic example of elections and our education system. So I've been advocating for youth participation in electoral processes since 2016, if I'm not mistaken. And every election cycle, there's the common question: will young people vote? Will young people show up? Will young people participate? Which is quite a boring question because it's not looking at what's the build up to that. It's just looking at the outcome, right? And it's too late to ask that question when political parties are campaigning. We need to look into the whole entire electoral cycle, right? So for me, my question is always, when they ask that question, is an 18-year-old will be voting for the first time this year, whether it's local government elections or national elections. Does that 18-year-old know what a mayor is or what the mayor does? Do they know what the role of the president is in setting up his cabinet? Do they know the functions of members in parliament? Do they know what the legislative is? And if you can give me yes for any of those answers, then I can entertain the question. But you can't, because primarily you walk out of your education, the basic education system, not understanding how this country is governed, not understanding the processes or the decision-making process of this country, right? And we expect then young people to participate into this process that they've been excluded from. And we say, but young people are nonchalant, young people are lethargic and whatnot, right? So we're creating a narrative about young people, but we haven't set up an environment or a foundation that will enable them to participate in those processes, right? So for me, I think when we start using the electoral process as an example, we need to start asking ourselves, when it comes to young people, what is it that we want to see for young people when it comes to the economic participation, for them participating in the economy, for them participating in decision-making processes? And once we define what it is that we want to see, do we want to see young people who are able to fully participate in the economy, who are able to either find jobs or create jobs, who are able to articulate what it is they want to see from the electoral process or the outcomes of policy making? If that's what we want to see, what is it that we need to put in place to ensure that happens? before we tackle a whole lot of things, that what foundations or what infrastructure needs to be put in place. Back to then the point I said about the education system. In our education system, whether it's mainstream basic education, whether it's colleges, whatever, what is it that we're doing to ensure that young people know about the democracy that we live in, the type of democracy we have, the constitutional democracy, representative democracy, participatory democracy, and the responsibility to that, and how they essentially can inform this particular process, right? That's one of the things. And sorry, I'm just also looking into my notes so that I don't just ramble. So once we have created the process of saying, this is what we need to do to ensure that young people are participating in the electoral process and they're informed to participate at a national level, at a provincial level, at a local level, then we're good to say, we know that in terms of decision making, we have equipped young people with the relevant tools to make informed decisions so that they can participate in the design of this country and also then subsequently into the economic systems of this country. But the problem is also our education system, you have the average 10-year-old who can't read for meaning and understanding. What is it that we're getting wrong when it comes to equipping, our toddlers, our teenagers into understanding some of the content that's being placed before them? Because if I can't read for meaning in grade 4, one day I'll have to interact with a law or an act and I can't interpret it, what it means, because I lack basic comprehension skills, right? And then someone is going to be a police officer without basic comprehension skills and they need to implement the law or, execute the law, but they can't read for understanding or read for meaning. Next thing you know, criminals are getting away with crimes because of basic comprehension. So we need to have a great relook in terms of our education system, our education curriculum, and the way we deliver our education. Is it delivered in a way that we are able to understand, comprehend, and ensure that the learner can, fully, adjust to or fully digest the information that has been provided to them, engage with it, and not just regurgitate it, engage with it and make meaning out of it, right? So that's also a key factor. Before we start looking at the 18-year-old, at the 19-year-old, the 10-year-old needs to be well equipped to understand the education. Secondly, it would be the question of, are we being taught things that are relevant for us to eventually participate in the economic systems, right? Am I being prepared for the marketplace? Am I being prepared to create my own jobs, right? And if the answer is yes, great. If the answer is no, we need to then reevaluate and look into that, right? That's one of the things we need to look into. And I think with young people as well, we need to organize and mobilize. Change is not going to happen via osmosis or because, I have a good idea, hey, this is what I reimagine the world to be, and automatically change is going to happen. No, we need to be mobilized. We need to organize and mobilize. If one thing shows like Ushaga Ilembe needs to teach us is that power is not given, power is taken. And if we want to take power from the elders and ensure that young people are providing direction in a manner that benefits and includes them, we need to organize and mobilize and ensure that we are also defining the agenda that is inclusive to young people of all demographics and all regions of the country, right? And then in some of the programs that we design, we think of, or we implement, we need to factor in two things: a proactive program and a reactive program. A proactive program is ensuring that the 10-year-old is able to read for meaning and understanding. The reactive one is that how do we ensure that the adult learner is able to read for learning and comprehension so that we don't have issues with that particular individual when they're 36 and above, right? And we're creating a generation that is unemployable, that now has to sit at home and face other mental issues that are related to that. And then I also, for me, just to summarize, what I'm trying to lead towards is that we need to essentially get the foundational aspects correct. We need to ensure that the foundation is correct, right? Right now, there's a lot of talk about AI, robotics, and fourth industrial revolution, right? And the need for us to be players in there. But the third industrial revolution still needs to be addressed. We still need to address the issues that come with power supply, with infrastructure. So you want me to be effective in using AI tools, but I don't have access to a laptop or data. I can't even, use a basic Excel sheet, but I need to be able to do coding. That does not make sense. So if we start ensuring that the basics are adhered to before because I think that's also the tendency that South Africa has when it comes to trying to play the big brother role, is that we always want to rush with the trends without ensuring that we've covered our basics, we've covered our bases correctly, and ensure that everyone is, no one person is left behind. So yeah, just to summarize that is that we need to think, what is it that we want to see young people do? What is the infrastructure that we need to put in place? We need to organize, we need to mobilize, and we need to remember that power is not given, power is taken. And if we need to take power from the elder generation, from 72-year-olds making decisions on our behalf, we need to organize and say, as the youth agenda, this is the agenda that we're setting. And we are mobilizing young people towards that particular agenda, and then ensure that we do not betray that particular agenda. We don't sell out to the particular agenda. That's my 2 cents.
Tammy, thank you so much. You've said some key points there that actually are standalone webinar discussions. I love the statement that you made about stars are born in the dark. And if anything, you began your statement by saying that, I don't know if I can actually answer this question, but I'll put this forth. And I think that you have actually essentially answered the question. Let's go back to basics. Let's go back to the foundations. You highlighted the very concerning issue around young people not being able to read for understanding, and the long-term consequence that this can have. And also ultimately how all of these factors somewhat shape how young people choose to engage with the state. And if anything, the stability of the political system, if I'm going to be more specific. TK, I want to bring you back into the discussion, about us. South Africa has on different occasions, if not on a daily basis, has expressed that economic growth is a priority. You had mentioned or posed the very important question to say, before we can ask, whether or not the G20 is a relevant platform, what is the national agenda? One can arguably say that South Africa has on different occasions expressed that economic growth is a priority. So one would arguably say that that is the agenda. So the question from me to you is, can South Africa afford to isolate itself without, in the name of advancing national interests? Because in prioritizing a national agenda, one of the consequences is economic isolation and backlash. Is South Africa in the position to unapologetically advance its national agenda?
No, and thanks for that. And I've actually got an article, I'm supposed to finish it today, about looking at South African national interest. And look, let's be very clear. South Africa doesn't have a national interest. I know that you come from the world of IR. You're going to say, but TK, DECO's got a document called the National Framework for South Africa's National Interest. I've read the document. I've spoken to DECO and I've told them, you can't say everything is a national interest. If everything is a national interest, nothing is a national interest. Because basically they repeat what the Constitution says, and you're asking yourself, okay, then how do we make hard decisions? When hard decisions face us, what's the adjudicating thing? And at the moment, we don't have that. The one thing I think we can characterize the era of previously of President Jacob Zuma and now of President Cyril Ramaphosa, because I think his legacy is set in stone. There's nothing at the moment you're going to get going forward that is new. It is optics and confusion. When countries speak of a national interest, and I'm going to make it very practical so that the audience can understand it. President Trump puts it quite clearly, it's America first. What does that look like? Well, it's a blunt instrument. He goes to say, listen, remember, this is America, it's the bastion of capitalism. He says we're going to take 15% of Intel. He goes to the leading tech company in the world, NVIDIA, the ones that allow for these very super, super small and very thin microchips, and says, listen, you can take your products to China, but you're going to pay a tax. Now, that's the definition of a national interest. Why did he do that? Because he says, look, there's a feeling in America, America is in decline, and part of the decline has been necessitated that there's a competitor. And the competitor is not just simply saying, look, you want to replace America, but it's competing with America on the key industries of the future. So what do? By the way, this also extends to Biden. They simply target it for purposes of national interest. Tell me, when's the last time South Africa targeted anything for purposes of national interest? Think of an industry, right? Think about let's speak about the steel industry. I come from, my hometown is the Vaal, Mfuleni. Mittal Steel is literally creaking and it will collapse. Is steel an interest for us? Electricity, right? I mean, that's almost like a basic. What I'm trying to get towards is this government does not have doesn't understand what national interest is. Now, if I think what the audience is probably asking is, say, look, I think we kind of all figured out that we don't have a national interest. What should it look like? And I'll be very blunt in putting it out there. South Africa's national interest, and maybe the answer to the question directly about, look, South Africa, by virtue of the makeup of our economy, South Africa will always have to be a trading nation. We literally don't have the ability to close shop for anyone, whether it's on the continent or whether it's a global world. So for South Africa to do well, South Africa always has to be a trading nation. But I think we need to be very circumspect about what do we mean by trade. I'm not one of those who says, listen, you just simply ignore America. I think you pick and choose what you want to take from America, right? The beauty, and this is, again, it goes back to where we have to say the government did well in the 90s. If you look at the exposure of South Africa's economy to the global world, it's actually perfect in the sense that it's what investors would tell you to do. It's hedged. We don't have more exposure. I think the most exposure we have is what, 11% or 10%. It's either towards the Chinese or the Europeans or the Americans. So our exposure is actually quite spread out quite nicely. Hence, we are able to sort of ride this through. But the next question we need to be asking is to say, and I know this is going to fall in your ambit, Dr. Mabatu, the issue of saying, if we say national interest, does it still make sense that we've got so many embassies around the world? Where are we getting economic value from? Well, we can't ignore America, because America will always be America, but it's a question of what do you want from America? Define it. Well, what America's taken from us and extracting is for their critical skills, right? I mean, their critical raw minerals, I think magnesium being the top one. Well, why? The question should be, how do we in the next 10 years make sure that we're not simply taking out magnesium from the ground and giving it to the Americans, but we're saying, listen, you want to buy it, you're going to have to buy it with us having added value to it. The reason I use the mark of 10 years is sometimes people who speak about policy don't want to tell citizens the truth. Policy is not made, you're not going to get results in 1 year or 2 years. By my calculations, and they can always be wrong because they're my calculations, we are literally 10 or 15 years behind of where we should be, based on poor mistakes and poor leadership policy-wise. Colleague previously spoke about education. We only now, it's a revelation that we must do early childhood development. That kind of proves my point. We're 10 to 15 years behind the curve. So and then obviously Europe, we're going to be circumspect. Europe is in deep decline. I know South Africans our dream was always to drive those German cars. Which cars are now trending in South Africa? We think we have problems. Germany is having a proper crisis to say, what's Germany without its Volkswagen, without Mercedes-Benz, right? So we also need to ask the question, in the Eastern Cape, does it make sense for the government to still subsidize those car industries from Germany? Because remember, we do subsidize them. That's why when we buy those, I think it's the Mercedes-Benz plant or the one in East London, there's a reason why it's so expensive in South Africa. We're subsidizing it, right? So it's a question, do we want to stick with that model? Or maybe we need to be more honest, and this is the path that I'm going towards. It will be controversial, so I'll end it at this. That, look, South Africa's future is intrinsically tied to SADC. Southern Africa is South Africa's future. We are a small little country of 60 million people, or 62, given whatever happens on the border on the day. But the key issue should be, if we then include the rest of SADC in our ambit, or what I will term, and I'll use a Russian term, sphere of influence, we're now looking at close to a population of 300 million people. That's a Nigeria type economy. Then the key question would be, we cannot be extractive like we were in the 90s, where South Africa simply said, checkers and ex-companies, you guys just go to the continent, do as you will. But we never gave those countries anything back. In fact, if we couldn't control empowerment at home, Black economic empowerment, what happened on the continent was an absolute mess. So the key issue should be, what does the rest of the SADC want? Well, it's quite clear. electricity is one, stable energy, energy for the future. Key issue of financial services sectors that work so people can have these accesses. These are things South Africa excels at. Why aren't we thinking to say, listen, our DBSA, big infrastructure, IDC, big infrastructure. When you guys go to the continent, it's going to be one thing now. You're no longer going as separate actors. You're going to go, you're going to negotiate and say, listen, in the DRC, and I know we've been humiliated in the DRC, we're going to be a bit more aggressive to say, listen, we need to be competing with what Trump is doing and the Chinese are doing to say, what do they want? Let's give them what they want. And let's also not be shy about what we want in return. And then obviously the one I'm going to say, when you speak about pure national interest here, here you speaking, Cohen, and the rest is, we need to be very honest. We have a problem in the region, and the problem in the region is called ZANU-PF. We never say anything. Our government is quiet as though ZANU's got something on them and they keep quiet. Because you cannot have national interest without being muscular in the approach. This is not me saying South Africa must be big brother. This is me saying South Africa must be strategic and not be idiotic. Many countries in the region all confess that ZANU-PF, and note what I say, ZANU-PF, not Zimbabweans, ZANU-PF, two separate things. ZANU-PF is a problem for the region. And if you speak to many people in the region, they're very blunt about it. They ask South Africa the question, what have you guys done to control this problem in the region? And the answer is dololo, nothing. So until South Africa and this government wakes up, for me, if we're being honest about national interest, when I believe there's national interest is when I see this government firmly start to say, we're going to sanction the elites from ZANU-PF from shopping in South Africa and their kids from coming into South Africa. And the second demand we're going to make is, ZANU, if you're not going to change your way in the region, we're going to assist you to change. And this is not South Africa alone, but speaking to other partners in SADC to say, how do we properly isolate ZANU-PF's elites? And if need be, how do we properly now have to come up with more muscular, and I'm going to just leave it there, say a more muscular approach. Because at the moment, until we get rid of the cancer that is ZANU-PF in the region, there is no national interest for South Africa. They deliberately undermine South Africa's interest in the region. And I think once we can get there, then we're going to see progress. Because here's probably, and I'd ask everybody to have a look, the region is in its worst crisis. Pick any country in SADC at the moment. Tell us they're not in crisis when it comes to the economy. And the problem is South Africa is not leading. And by leading, I mean putting money where you can say, listen, industrialization, financing for industrialization needs to come from South Africa's private sector in the region. And this is maybe a bit different to what people are normally hearing, because I know we speak about migration, and I think I'm one of those, controversially so. I do believe that borders have to be respected and that when you come in the right way. But you also have to give something back to the region, because South Africa cannot simply say we're blocking people out. We need to be asking, how do we get into those other countries and ensure that their industries work? So that, because no one really wants to, we want to work in a SADC where we can all move around knowing that it's almost on an equal footing, not that we're running away from something. So to answer your question in a deep way, there is no national interest in this country, in South Africa, because we don't have politicians that have graduated to understand what we mean by national interest. And if you're going to say, what will it look like? The first step would have to be controlling the cancer that is ZANU-PF.
TK, you raised some very valid points there, especially around this whole notion around liberation brotherhood. And I know that there's a lot of controversy just in terms of, there's an argument around, there's an active intention of destabilizing former liberation parties. And in the same breath, there's also, the argument to say that, what do the people want? And those arguments that are made, whether or not it is true, but what do the people want? And what is in the best interest? An unstable region in this particular case, an unstable SADC is an unstable South Africa. And from a holistic perspective, even within the G20, when you look at the contribution that, the other 19 countries make in comparison to South Africa, it does really, even if you include other gatherings such as BRICS, it puts a couple of things into perspective. Mpilo, you know what? You made mention of a very important point, and that around, the digital economy. More specifically, you had mentioned that, we speak about our digital economy when we've got not only a digital divide, but also other issues such as, educational divide. from your perspective analysis and everything that has, been, all the contributions rather that have been made, do you think that when you include factors such as the digital economy, and this is a quote unquote hype word that a lot of countries from across different regions are somewhat incorporating into their policies, is this just a trend word? And is this something that, regardless of whether or not, South Africa in particular, whether or not we choose to embrace it, it is something that is shaping how we do economics. It is something that is shaping national policies. With that in mind, do you think that South Africa needs to take a step back and reformulate? I will take one of the specific issues that you have mentioned, and that being around, the educational divide. That, yes, acknowledge that 4IR and digital economy is happening. However, we need to take it back to basics and address fundamental things such as the educational divide.
No, thank you so much, Doc, again. I have contradicting answers to this, and I'm going to just explain why I say I have contradicting answers. Firstly, looking at the policy from government, particularly the National Treasury, there's a document which was written, I think, in 2023, if I'm not mistaken, called the Financial Inclusion Plan of South Africa. So that document speaks about, obviously, the financial inclusion of people in relation to banking and payment systems. And part of its ambitions was to create an environment whereby we'll have what you call now a digital financial ID, which later is going to be called a digital ID. So basically a digital financial ID whereby everything in terms of your finances and everything, you can get them online. And later on a later stage for countries, for example, like Kenya, it is already existing. Countries like Ukraine, it is already existing, whereby now we have a digital ID. So to your point, if the government, are they implementing this in their policies? Yes, they are. However, there's a big problem in terms of this implementation, and it's an implementation of divide, as I just mentioned it. It is a situation whereby there are people who are going to have access to these digital services, but not everyone. It is a continuation of what we've been saying, for example, since what we know as liberation in 1994, whereby we all thought that we are going to have the same equal footing into the economy. But then we're faced with a problem whereby other people were not equipped enough to be able to participate into this new economy, particularly the financial services economy, which is booming and actually contributing a lot into the country's GDP. So on the point of should we take a step back, I think firstly is not a point of taking a step back, but rather it's a point of doing the most basic and necessary things, such as building infrastructure. I think one of the speakers mentioned a point that we cannot be speaking about the fourth industrial revolution and speaking about coding and AI, all of those kind of things, whereby the children who are studying physical sciences, particularly chemistry in high school, today they have to imagine what a chemical looked like because they don't have any laboratory. Something that has been studied for decades and decades, but even today you still have students who have to imagine how a popping hydrogen sun, when it comes off the of the hydrogen, how it sounds when it attracts oxygen. They have to imagine that, and they have to put that into practice, and they have to pass those particular things. So we cannot be very that much ambitious, even if though now the government is implementing those things, because we can see that coding and such things are being implemented in making sure that actually we do participate in the future and in the economy of the future. But now what is going to happen is the fact that you're going to have a very few number of people that are going to be participating, that are going to be skilled up, with those knowledges or in terms of digital inclusion as well as digital literacy. So the fundamentals are two here. Number one, you must make sure that you're not left behind in this train that is moving, because you cannot stop everything and say, let us go and fix the basics and let us not do what other countries are doing. But secondly, we should make sure that what we call "do not leave no one behind" is not only just a slogan, and you know that it's basically just a slogan alone, which is not going to materialize, but we should really be concerned about touching the basic necessities, such as ensuring that, firstly, in South Africa, I'm going to go back to this point. There is no way that you are saying you're going to develop this economy while the majority of the people, which are young people, are actually not contributing economically into the system. There is no way that you are going to do it. And if you are going to do it, you're going to be faced with the very same problem that now the middle class in South Africa is actually faced with, by high taxes, but those taxes are actually not contributing anything meaningful into the economy, because when they are paying such high taxes in South Africa, we actually up there with the Scandinavian countries in terms of paying taxes. But on top of that, those taxes that you're paying as a South African, particularly as a young person, what then happens is that you still need to pay for education if you decide to have children. You still need to pay for private healthcare. So in a way, we are not doing anything as government to make sure that there is state capacity in order for you to create those particular things. And I think Prof. TK has already spoken much about it in terms of what needs to happen from that particular aspect. But just to answer you, Mabato, in terms of is the government doing something about it? Yes, they are doing something about it. But the main problem is that there are a lot of people that are still going to be left behind. We are seeing a pattern, and they are not doing anything to change it. We are going to see very few schools, even now, and there's a whole policy in the Department of Basic Education about teaching coding. But I'm very sure that from where I come from, the public schools, they are not teaching that particular coding, because first, you don't have teachers that are going to teach those particular coding, but number two, you don't have the infrastructure in terms of network connectivities and other equipment and resources that you need in order for you to teach those particular subjects. So what is going to happen? We are just going to continue with the divide, as we're seeing now, with a very few number of people in the population gaining those particular skills that are going to be needed in the future, while a lot of people are still going to be left behind. And we're still going to be left with what we often call an Irish coffee scenario, whereby very few people, are sprinkles at the top of the cream, while the rest of the population eats a black coffee, and in a way trying to make an illustration that actually these are people who did not get any particular skills. So in terms of what needs to be done, obviously, I will always emphasize on infrastructure development. There should be infrastructure development in South Africa. And the points have been made, for example, about how DFIs such as your IDC can actually contribute into making those infrastructure available to people. We still have a lot of things. And again, into the point of how then do we find about those particular things? Because when you raise those particular points, you are then confronted with the question of where are we going to get the money from? We are always confronted with those questions. And that now, I think it speaks then to all of us to say we should demand accountability, number one. We should demand accountability, but also number two, we should really start and rethink economics, because it is a social science. As much as they try to make it a science of its own, economics, it is a social science. You do model it in the way that your society is made up into making it work for you. That's why countries have different economic policies and different ways of development, because it is something that you can tailor around the society. A society which is like South Africa, whereby majority of the population are actually young people, you should be concerned about making an economic policy that is going to attract those particular skills of young people. There are still so many skills that young people do have in South Africa, but they're actually not being utilized into them being formal contributors into the economy. For example, if you look into the economy of Japan, which is a huge growing population, you can see that the kind of economy that they have, it speaks to that particular kind of population. And obviously, we can talk about the decline that we've been seeing now. But the point here about the economics itself is that we shouldn't treat it, as this sacred thing whereby it cannot be modeled in a particular way to ensure that it is responsive to the needs of our people at this current day. So, I think I'll just stop there from now, Doctor.
Thank you, Mpilo. As you're speaking, what comes to mind, I'm just, making the different connections and contributions that were made, just to say that in highlighting and in acknowledging that each country is faced by its own challenges, and therefore the economic, political, national policies, therefore, are informed by the specific national challenges that are addressed. You touched based on the issue that Tammy raised around, educational divide, and that being more pronounced in the ability to comprehend. I'm going to tie this in with what in the comment section, Becky mentions that the issue around comprehension is not only an issue amongst young people, but it also goes into the nation as a whole. You've got adults, 30s, 40s, who also don't know the different roles of public office bearers, and this once again shapes, influence the, amongst other factors, the political psyche, or let me take a step back and rather say how South Africans are choosing to engage with the state. It is shaping. Sometimes we often ask ourselves that before 1994, we had, a very large, big, engaged society. There was a different context. There was a different type of leadership at hand. And Impilo raised, one of the key points that you also raised, and this is something that TK also highlighted, is, also the whole issue around leadership, governance, or the lack thereof. Also within the comment section, Vusi mentions that, the G20 is once in a generation platform, and that it is something that we should take quite seriously. It is something that we should also not take quite lightly, and in essence, take advantage of this particular platform to reshape our economic landscape, especially for youth in townships and rural areas. Moiketsi, I want to bring you into this. I'm going to go back to that statement that you had made around nothing for us without us. Young people have overtly and in different ways voiced their needs. I opened up this discussion by mentioning the state of civic engagement over the years. And in essence, civic engagement amongst young people, not only in South Africa, but on average throughout the continent is declining. And some would say that, this despondency that is rising because the needle is shifting. What is a needle that isn't shifting? And in drawing back to what Vusi made, the comment that he made around, let us just, essentially what I get from what Vusi is saying is meet the people where they are. If the issue is around reconfiguring an increased inclusion of young people among townships and rural areas, it may not look grand. It may not look, quote unquote, how it looks like in China, in Thailand. It will look like what it needs to look like, and essentially reimagining what economic development is. In essence, what I'm trying to get from you, not so much of a question as it is to say, do we indeed need to reimagine what youth economic development is, and therefore youth participation within this reimagined version of economic development? That is quite a broad question, but I trust that you'll be able to tackle it. Moigezi?
Can you hear me, Dr. Maya?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. No. Thank you for the question. I mean, and it's an important question, and maybe I'll start with the first one around what is that needle that isn't shifting. And I think what all the speakers certainly was come out powerfully for me is that the needle that isn't shifting is that political will, right? And we continuously talk about there is in this country a lack of political will to meaningfully engage young people, but also to include young people, right? Because every quarter we know what SADC does, right? We'll release the quarter labor surveys, and we are the ones as young people making the loudest noise. We've got institutions like Mistra, we've got academics here like yourselves, including Dr. Bowe, who've been doing this work, who've been trying to advise at multiple levels in your own ways, your DECOs, the Department of Women, Youth and Peoples and Persons with Disabilities, the Education Department, the Higher Education Department, and the various government departments that we have that are supposed to, not only shape policy, but also work towards, implementation of that policy, not only at national level, but also I think at a local level, right? But oftentimes we see that there is that lack of political will. And yes, at the same time, that can be attributed to some of the challenges that Tammy highlighted around comprehension, right? We know the fact that, especially when you're looking at the Auditor General's reports, the damning reports that she releases around the fact that 2025 South Africa, we still have municipal managers, right? The people who are entrusted with running those municipalities effectively not being able to read the Excel documents, the budgets and so on and so on, right? And for me, I can't answer. Let me not even say I can't answer. Maybe the answer around then shifting that needle of political will, I think perhaps lies in some of Tammy's. I'm quite lobbied by what Tammy suggested around what is going to be our youth agenda, what is our generational mission, as it were, right? And how are we going to make sure that we don't betray it? But in that lies that thing of mobilizing ourselves as young people, but also organizing ourselves and certainly conscientizing ourselves around your particular query around what does youth emancipation or economic emancipation, economic inclusion actually look like for us as young people, right? Because we certainly like and also like what Dr. Boy raises around defining things. We need to be able to define what does the economy mean for us, what does policy means for us. I mean, we have a national youth policy that was released many years ago, and I think colleagues like Tammy participated in that process. And where are we in terms of the targets that were put in that national youth policy, right? How far are we in terms of the measures of success? What has worked? What has not worked, right? So I think for me, in terms of youth economic inclusion, and certainly we need to start thinking around how do we organize our young people to start looking at some of these policies that speak into our lives, where decisions, where the powers that be have made certain decisions on our behalf, right? And we can actually say, as a young person from a township, from a rural area, this does not work for me because I live in a rural area and I do not have access, to a smartphone, to data, right? And this is what's going. You need to change this policy in this particular way to speak to my lived experience, right? Because as I said earlier on, we've made it difficult, Dr. Mungai, for people to survive, in particular for young people to survive, right? There's red tape everywhere. Even when you're looking at, I certainly don't endorse illegal mining. There's amazamas as well. I don't endorse that, right? But certainly young people are increasingly going into those industries and even, the gangs and so on because they've got no any other alternative. And what do the alternatives look like? And I think we need to think deeply and meaningfully about that, right? So I'm answering your questions by further asking critical questions that I think we must answer collectively, not only as young people working in the youth civil society space or the youth development space, but certainly with the young people who are not in these spaces, right? And I think it needs a whole of society approach. And I know we speak about this oftentimes in our policies, but it does need a whole of society approach. We need the academics in the room, right? We need the engineers in the room. We need civil society in the room, right? And perhaps maybe this opportunity that we are being afforded through, the national dialogue, maybe that is another platform that we can leverage at a national level. And I know, much criticism has been laid to say it's another talk shop and so on, but we cannot afford to be out of that space as young people, to set our own agenda as Tammy, encourages us to do. That we need to set our own, what is going to be our youth agenda going into this national dialogue. I get it, we've launched it, and now it must come to us in the communities, and we must raise our hands as young people to say, I will host a dialogue, even if it's with 5 people. I'm here, I will host it at a taxi rank, because our young people are in taxi ranks as well, right? I will host it at an informal market, right? So I leave it there to say, and perhaps to carry on the thinking that Tammy left us with. Let's further mobilize and organize and conscientize ourselves as young people to make sure that these decisions that are being made by the powers that be, now we are changing things, right? We're no longer asking for power, we're taking it, as Tammy said. Dr. Mongai?
Thank you so much, Moiketsi. I was going to ask a follow-up question, but you answered it brilliantly so at the end. Tammy, I'm going to pose one of, the critical questions that Moiketsi asked, and that is around, what is this generation's mission? We tend to say that each generation has got a different mission, and obviously one would say, well, isn't that economic emancipation? I mentioned a bit earlier on that this is quite a broad, the words and the phrasing of this webinar is quite broad, but also very complex. We heard different contributions around the role of, social media, how that influences how young people and people in general, but more specifically, how young people choose to engage with the state. So it's a two-part question, and Moiketsi, gave some examples of what I'm about to ask. One, what is this generation's mission? And second to that, in light of the different factors that are influencing state-society relations, but youth-state relations, what does mobilization look like? Or are we not meeting young people where they are? I love what Moiketsi mentioned around go to the taxi rank and mobilize young people there. And what I hear from what he said is that don't rely on national platforms to engage with young people, that all of us, regardless of what sector space we are at, wherever we find ourselves, we need to locate young people where they are. Thanks.
Yeah, Doc, I feel like I'm getting the interesting questions. Not so easy, but I also want to just quickly, just for a second, touch base on the previous question around the needle that's not shifting, that was asked to Moiketsi. And I want to add another element is that we also need to have honest conversations about employment readiness programs and the impact of youth development organizations or NPOs when it comes to capacitating young people and preparing them for the workspace. There seems to be no shift there in terms of the youth unemployment stats. We've got these organizations that are being given either millions in funding to create, to capacitate young people towards being employable. But every quarter, the stats keep saying that there's no change, there's no shift. So what is really being done in that sector, and what are some of the things that we need to talk about? And are these employment readiness programs doing what they're supposed to? And the reason I want to highlight that is because you guys might be aware of the song, the unofficial national anthem, which is Sister Bettina. It says in between, in the meantime, sidla ubusha bethu. And I feel like that's what's happening with the employment readiness programs, these incubators and whatnot, is that in the meantime, while you're still in your youth, you're moving from stipend to stipend, but not actually participating in an actual job or in the economy in itself. You find yourself moving from stipend to stipend, from this program to that program, and the next thing you're 36 and you're unemployable, right? That was just something I wanted to just touch base on, that there needs to be an honest conversation there. Generational mission. Yeah, Nzima. When you asked that question, I immediately thought back to Seth Mazibuko, who's also among the youth of 1976, who always says his generation was the generation of stone throwers. We need to be the generation of stone gatherers. And for me, that speaks to essentially we need to build institutions that are going to benefit our generation and generations to come. The previous generation were throwing stones at an institution that was excluding them. We need to be the ones building institutions that are inclusive towards every South African child, every African child, to ensure that what we lost in the past can be regathered and be brought back into our spaces, right? We've lost quite a lot. So we didn't just lose land. We lost identities. We lost our memory, When I say we lost our memory, I'm not talking about amnesia or not, but we lost, in essence, the essence of who we are and why we did things the way we did them. And it's also, visible in terms of the Constitution only recognizing essentially 11 tribes, and people having to, ascribe to a tribe that they not necessarily are. You take Amaxhosa, for instance, you have Amahlubi, Amapondo, but when it comes to a form, they are forced to take Xhosa. You've got Mapulana, who are, taking under Sepedi, or Balobedi, who are, the same process, right? We've lost in the essence of who we are, the memory that we have, right? And we need to build institutions or, frameworks that ensure that, one, we bring back the essence of who we are as communities within South Africa, within the different demographic or regional areas that we come from, and the identities that come with that, and ensuring that we do not create a better than, identity, but we also, in addressing all these identities, also then build a national identity to say, as a South African, this is who we are as South Africans. I don't think we have a common voice when it comes to say, I'm a South African and this is what it means to be a South African, right? Despite the fact that I'm Tsonga or whatnot, right? But what is that pride that we have, or that, that national identity that we have? We're still pretty much a segregated country. We are still pretty much a country that's not unified at all, and that's not moving in the same direction. We have people also calling for secessions or whatever it's called in the Western Cape, right? So we need to build those particular institutions to ensure that we have a national identity, we have our memory, and we also have an inclusive economic system, and also a system that allows everyone to participate, whether in the economy or in the decision-making process. That's one. What does youth mobilization look like? It's not academic. It's not an NQF level 10 process. It's a matter of identifying where people are and creating a platform for people to engage with the content of the day. Whether those people, you meet them at a church building, whether you meet them in one person's house, whether you meet them at the park, at the garage, wherever there's a place where you can also gather people or mobilize people. It does not always have to be mass gatherings. Mass gatherings are always there, right at the end. But as a build-up, you start in smaller formations where, you start having conversations on matters. Let's say, for instance, we're trying to speak about a national identity or this national dialogue that's currently taking place. Those small pockets where communities are in, you go to them, you engage them through the channels that they've also created, right? Sometimes in rural areas, where you will have conversations related to the communities. You go there, you engage there, right? You don't have to necessarily invite the whole community of and bring them to Jack Bueta's hall somewhere far from them. You go to them and understanding how it is that they normally engage. Young people love having fun because because of our mental issues and a lot of challenges we face, we'd rather focus on things that are entertaining so that we forget about the challenges that we face. Create spaces, small pockets of spaces where they can also have fun, but while discussing these particular issues. So in terms of engagements, I usually, for instance, when I want to talk about policy with young people, I create sessions called Whose Voice Do You Want to Hear in Parliament, right? And it's a fun way of them reenacting without realizing what Parliament would be addressing, right? So they're having fun, but in actual fact, they're also, speaking on issues that they're facing and providing tangible solutions. And then they realize, this is how I can fit into society, right? Create initiatives that also that are also somewhat age appropriate. If you want me to attend a public hearing and I'm an 18-year-old and I have to be in a room of 500 people, one person speaks for 30 minutes and then the next person, I might not find that conducive. So make sure that, when you mobilize people, you understand the demographic, but it's not always, NQF level 10. Meet people where they are, in the environment that they are, and speak the language that addresses their heart. Thank you, Doctor.
That's so brilliant. I love what you mentioned around two things. You asked the question around, do we have a collective or a national identity? Apart from our ethnic identities, do we have a national identity? And another key point that you raised is that mobilization is in the everyday. It's not just on TV, it's not just academics, not just quote unquote high level, but it is in the everyday. And it also touches base on what Mahlaro mentioned around supporting mental health. We are a dysfunctional society. And Tammy, you had mentioned that we lost a lot, not just the physical, but memory, psychologically. And we sometimes see the generational impact of this. I love the statement. You made a quote, but the latter part of the quote was that, let us be the generation of stone gatherers. Matlharomela, I want to ask you, where does university, in about a minute or two, where does the university fit into this? Or perhaps universities have, especially post fees must fall era, has actually contributed towards or reignited more specifically student mobilization. Some would also arguably say that post 2018, I would say that perhaps there's been a dip, but arguably maybe it's taking participation is not just being stone throwers, but it's shifting the structure within. But what role does university play in this? Thank you.
In what specifically?
Sorry, in student mobilization and gathering students and using that large platform to not only educate, but to get young people's insights, to also increase mobilization beyond universities, because we've all been either, through TVET, through university structures, through some form of educational post-secondary, some of us that is post-secondary educational structures, and you enter the workforce and no longer as active as perhaps you were within university.
So now how are institutions
what role
mobilizing?
All right, let me rephrase. So the question is, what role, in light of everything that has been mentioned in terms of how mobilization is changing and has changed, what role does the university play in educating the youth, in making sure that we're not just stone throwers, but stone gatherers?
Oh, okay. Look, I think there's generations and there's different types and mobilization strategies for each and every generations, and it's a cycle. We moved from throwing stones during apartheid, but people are conscientized through institutions. If we look at Steve Biko, he's one of the people that went to university, and when he was at university, he started to write about Black consciousness, and he mobilized institutions across South Africa. So institutions have always been an integral part of shaping society. And Steve Biko would go to institutions and to conference papers and present his paper. So institutions, I'll repeat it again, they've been part and parcel of integral meaning of mass movement. Now, there's been a shift in terms of fees must fall because I think the youth also realized on how harsh it was on some leaders of the fees must fall and what other things happened during the fees must fall. Some people gained and others had to lose their degrees. And there's also a shift today in terms of what we're owed to gain. You are hired at a company, so it's hard for you to fight against the bread. It was this where you get your bread from, So that's the kind of shift that we have today. So which means the shift has moved towards boardroom politics, which work very hard. It's boardroom politics are not easy; they're very hard. The conversations are very hard in terms of boardroom politics because you don't have the background of your colleagues outside. You don't have the pressure from the outside. Today, if you protest, for instance, at Wits University, if you protest, they're going to call military cars on campus like it's the apartheid era. And students are going to be threatened. They're going to be washed with water, rubber bullets. Just, I think, 2021, someone died because of rubber bullets, but that person was also not a student, But I'm not endorsing that he should have shot a student. No, I'm just saying that you see there's been quite a shift. And the shift again is that you have a black person against a black person. So also the fight has also changed. But what academia exists to do is to solve issues of society, especially when you move towards postgraduate degrees. You're moving towards understanding how society should be shaped and what is lacking in society and where support is supposed to be given. So the main point now is, how do we take the knowledge that we create and take it down to the ground, to the communities back in the rurals, and apply that high-level knowledge in terms of conscientization. Our issue, again, that we have is that it's our leaders. I'll always put it, our leaders today, they're not accountable to society. They're not accountable to anyone. They are accountable to themselves. Appointments that are just made by certain individuals within a certain group. So it's quite difficult now in terms of mobilization, because one, you have black against black. Two, it's groups of people looking for positions. So it's no longer about Ubuntu, what is good for our people. So the fight is different. Some people say it's neo-colonialism or neoliberalism, So that's where we are today in terms of the role that academia plays in terms of mobilizing students. But yes, we release our papers for people to read. They're available on different platforms, but that's not extensive. We need to go to our high schools, we need to go to our primaries, we need to go and preach whatever we believe, whatever we've written about. Another issue we have is in terms of funding towards our humanities students. These people research about the social science of us, of society. So if such people are not funded, we're not going to understand how. And it's something that Mpilo, mentioned. We're not going to understand where the gap is in terms of being human enough whenever we use artificial intelligence to mobilize our people, for instance. So that's what is currently happening. So our people are being crippled in terms of research. More research is being skewed towards, the STEM fields. So we need to see how we can conscientize also those STEM people. So that's the role that we've been trying to play in terms of also TVETs, ensuring that TVETs are supported. Not everyone is supposed to be a researcher. We need to go back. Some people need to go to TVETs. Yeah. So that's the kind of role that we play, Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Lennon, I know that you had to jump off, but I see that you're back. I'm hoping that you're still on. Are you still online with us?
Hope I'm still audible.
Perfect. To wrap us up, if it's a two-part question, right? So I might be just a bit unfair here. One of the questions in the chat is that, where's the informal economy situated in the conversation around unemployment, especially youth unemployment, and what role can SADC play in bridging the gap between formal and informal economy? And then to that, to wrap us up, if the SA government had to come to you and ask you for advice in terms of centralizing or giving young people a voice within the G20 platform, what would you say?
Thank you. It's always tough to speak last, especially after such a powerful panel. So first, I also want to thank all the organizers, the Mailing Guardian, Good Governance Africa, and all other institutions that made this webinar possible. Even yourself with the excellent moderation, the good professors there that presented. I learned a lot from them. I wish there was a sequel to this, or even a platform where we could meet and continue this conversation. So I consider myself a Pan-African, and I also work for a Pan-African institution. Africa's aspirations to make sure that Africa is peaceful, with many hotspots of violence, violent conflict on the continent, including very close to our own region here in northern Mozambique and in DRC. I mentioned the Sahel, where there's instability. So I think while South Africa is chairing the BRICS, we need to find ways in which the South African government can influence the bigger countries, multilateral institutions such as the United Nations Security Council, to act, but in particular for the African Union also to be more active in stopping conflict. The second thing is security, and in particular, we'll talk about food security. A hungry man is an angry man. I think one of these Jamaican artists made a song around that, in that majority of African countries, they struggle with food security, although we have the biggest arable land that is underutilized. So we need to deal with so many insecurities that we have on the continent. And lastly, development. We need to develop our own countries and stop being dependent in a constant state of victimhood as Africans. We can learn in the G20 with some of the countries in the G20 that have done extremely well. In particular, China, how it has taken millions of people out of extreme poverty on an annual basis. Our people live mostly in poverty, and for us as Africans to be respected in the community of nations, we need to make sure that all these issues are fixed. So moving from just a South African context, we need to look at a regional context in terms of some of the aspirations in Agenda 2063, such as the Continental Free Trade Agreement. The only way we're going to stop some of these challenges is if we open up trade, and if that trade is fair, and if Africa can come together and make the African market more powerful, so that people trade, businesses grow. But the Continental Free Trade Agreement also comes with the free movement of people. It's extremely difficult for Africans to travel the continent or to travel to a West African country where I had to pay close to 200 euros to get into this country. Now, if these things are fixed collectively as a continent, we've got a starting point to when we get our space in the Security Council, in economic multilateral institutions, to have a strong voice. So answering the question of small traders, some of the small traders are cross-border traders, and go look at some of the corridors for trade on the African continent. The Beitbridge border post, if you look at border posts in West Africa, and it's mostly women that struggle with this. We need to make sure that we ease up movement of people and people to be able to trade and make a living. So a lot of investments needs to be given to small businesses. I know a lot of work is being done by South African government in terms of capacitating small businesses. I think more efforts can be done, and we can also learn from others. There's this idea of South-South and triangular cooperation. If we can prioritize South-South countries in the global South, the developing world, need to really learn from each other. For countries that are developed, we need to get a bit of skills transfer from them. At the end of the day, it's us as Africans that should be responsible for our own development. Then lastly, I just want to congratulate and maybe also give a bit of advice to our colleagues in the Youth 20. I've been attending a lot of virtual events, including this one, and interacting with them. And I can 100% tell you that there's a lot of great work and innovation that they've put in some of these engagements. I know some have even gone to some provinces on a weekly basis. I see engagements, but there's a need in particular on the African continent to bring along some continental youth formations, institutions. In each and every single country, there are national youth councils. Some of them are like equivalent of the NYDA here in South Africa. I think it's very important to bring them on board to these conversations around the G20. Then in November, after the big conference, I think there's a need of continuation. I think we can take lessons from the BRICS. When South Africa was chairing the BRICS, I still see connections of young people that were part and parcel of the South Africa's BRICS chairing, who still form continental networks and engagements and bringing BRICS alive. So our work within the Y20 should not end in November. I hope there's enough funding to make sure that the Y20 is institutionalized and works closely with other institutions, particularly for civic engagement. But really, this was a powerful engagement, and I hope all of us have access to political parties and one day lead political parties and govern, because with all these great ideas, we write papers, we discuss them on webinars, but we at times leave the least educated to govern to some extent. Then you look at countries that are doing well, such as China. The whole central committee of the Chinese Communist Party are engineers, well-educated people. So it also takes us young people that want to see the change to get into these political parties, influence policy, contest elections, and be part of governance. I'm really thankful that I was invited to this platform, and again, thank you for this privilege.
Yeah, thank you, Lennon, and thank you for wrapping us up. And there you have it. Someone in the comment section, I think it's Nzabogazi, who in particular, we said that based off of the contributions that have been made, what she gathers is that we need to reimagine. Specifically, said that we need to reimagine how we look at our economy. I will expand that by saying that we need to reimagine, perhaps, and one of my key takeaways is that perhaps we need to reimagine what development is. What we need to reimagine the economy. What does economic development mean and look like to us? We need to reimagine the role of institutions. In one of TK's responses, he mentioned that, why do we only see universities as the only avenue out of poverty? We need to reimagine participation. Both Moiketsi and Tami had mentioned that mobilization happens in the everyday and in essence, meet young people where they are. And to me, what that highlights is that we all have a responsibility to contribute towards this, and this is going to sound very cliche, but towards the South Africa that we want to see. And I know that that brings along, other key issues that were highlighted, such as what does it mean to be South African? What is the common and collective identity that we have that Tami had highlighted? This has been a very stimulating conversation, and my hope is that we can have a part 2 of this and making it more broad by involving and having contributions from other African nations so that we, to contribute towards this rich discussion and, to further contribute towards practicals. And I just thank you to each and every one of our key participants. I think that I don't stand alone by saying that I've definitely will be leaving here with more questions. I'll definitely be leaving here being challenged. And I just thank you once again to everyone for making time. It's greatly valued, it's greatly appreciated. And thank you to all, to everyone who joined in. I know that I couldn't attend to all of the questions that were mentioned within the chat section, but it does not go unnoticed. And just thank you so much. Once again, we will put in efforts to have a part 2 of this, but thank you once again, and do enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so
very
much.
Thank you.